Whether you're just starting your Diablo 4 journey or looking to jump into the endgame, this Necromancer build has you covered, offering a potent leveling experience that scales really well into Diablo 4's World Tier 3 content and beyond. When you think Necromancer, minions and raising the dead to fight for you might come to mind, but in this build we're sacrificing all these undead companions in favor of enhancing our own power. Like most Necromancer builds, this one requires some setup, but here are the broad strokes of the build. We'll be buffing our Bone Spear to deal massive damage with high crits, while simultaneously debuffing our foes with the vulnerable status effect, allowing us to continue dealing even more damage. We'll use Corpse Tendrils to pull enemies together, applying vulnerable and following up with Corpse Explosions for massive AoE damage. This build excels at shredding through packs of enemies, even elites, and it's entirely reliant on understanding how vulnerable works, and making sure you have reliable ways to apply it. Vulnerable as a status effect is pretty straightforward. It makes enemies take more damage from all sources. You can see that an enemy is vulnerable by looking for the purplish glow around their health bar. Vulnerable enemies will take 20% bonus damage from all sources, and that's just a baseline. You can find affixes and gear that pushes that number even higher, and you absolutely should, because as a Necromancer, applying this effect on enemies is easy to do and won't even cost you any of your precious essence. But to get into that, we need to talk about abilities. There are 4 abilities that make this build tick. Bone Splinters is your basic attack, but we're only really using it for essence generation. 1 point here is more than enough to carry you all the way through World Tier 3. I do recommend dropping a point into Enhanced Bone Splinters for more projectiles. More projectiles means more damage. Also, if you're just starting out and in the early game, put a point into Initiate's Bone Splinters here, so that your basic attack has a chance to apply the vulnerable status effect. There are better ways to do this in the mid to late game, so remember this because we'll be coming back to it. But until you've opened up the map a good bit, Initiate's Bone Splinters is the way to go. Bone Spear is the star of the show and your primary source of spike damage, so you'll want to max this one out with 5 points. Bone Spear fires a projectile in a straight line that damages and passes through enemies and then bounces back. Enhanced Bone Spear makes it even better. Now when the spear bounces back, it'll break into 3 projectiles. And you know what that means? More damage. And just like with Bone Splinters, we can make our Bone Spear apply vulnerable as well, but with the same caveat. There's an aspect you can get from Gul'ran's slums in Dry Steppes called Splintering Aspect. This basically makes your Bone Spear apply vulnerable to every single enemy it hits past the first one. But you probably won't see this dungeon for a while, so for now, put a point into Supernatural Bone Spear. As soon as you unlock Splintering Aspect, I recommend returning to both Bone Splinters and Bone Spear and swapping out the vulnerable upgrades for some of the crit chance upgrades instead. Corpse Explosion is the next ability, and this lets you make all the little corpses on the ground explode and deal damage in an area. You're going to want Enhanced Corpse Explosion to make a bigger boom, and Plagued Corpse Explosion to make your explosions do 8% more damage to vulnerable targets. Corpses and corpse explosions are a huge part of what make this build work, but it needs a lot of help from passives to really come together, which we'll talk about soon. And lastly, Corpse Tendrils is the final ability that we need to really understand this build and make it work. Corpse Tendrils is essentially an AoE pull, but when we put a point into Enhanced Corpse Tendrils and Plagued Corpse Tendrils, this makes it so that we can apply vulnerable, slow, and stun to massive groups of enemies all at once every 10 seconds or so. And because our corpse explosions deal extra damage to enemies that are slowed, stunned, or vulnerable, this sets us up nicely to spam our explosions until everything on screen is dead. It's also handy because multiple gear affixes can benefit here. Whether your gear has plus damage to slowed, stunned, vulnerable, crowd-controlled enemies, you're getting extra damage because of how many status effects Corpse Tendrils applies at once. These are the main ingredients to make this build a powerhouse, and while it's good for leveling, it really shines when you've gotten to level 50 and gotten all the talent point unlocks from the world map renown rewards. We'll get into passives, other abilities, and where to put the rest of your points in a minute, but first we should talk about some of the weaknesses of this build, what to expect, and how to combat them. As you're slaying every demon you can get your hands on, you'll inevitably notice that while you're great at dishing out the damage, you're not so great at taking it. You're downright squishy, in fact. Maybe not glass cannon levels of squishy, but close enough that you really need to pay attention and watch your positioning. Things can be going fine for you 1 second, and then the next you find yourself standing in a poison puddle for a little too long and you're dead. Mobility is a problem for Necromancers in general, so keep your eyes peeled for items that give you an extra dodge charge to make getting out of sticky situations just a little bit easier. And adjacent to the squishiness is healing. There's just not a lot of it to go around, even with gear that gives you life on kill. I did find a legendary that gives me a 30% chance to spawn a healing blood orb whenever I explode a corpse, which has mostly fixed my healing problem, but I didn't find that until late game, and I had to rely on healing potions for for most of the leveling experience. The next big con for this build is that both essence management and single target encounters can be really tricky sometimes. When you're out there killing screens full of enemies, you're essentially laying little landmines all over the place that you can explode to deal damage and to regenerate some essence. But when you're stuck in a 1v1, you really have to work to generate those corpses. Since most of your spike damage is coming from Bone Spear, and it costs essence to cast, you can find yourself feeling frantic and starved in solo boss battles. The essence generation from your basic skill Bone Splinters is good and all, but when you're this squishy and there's no one but you to take the aggro, standing still and casting splinters at the boss is a good way to take massive and unnecessary damage. The good news is, there are passives that really help with both corpse and essence generation, so let's go over those now. Starting from the top, maxing out Unliving Energy and Imperfectly Balanced is a must. You'll have more essence to work with, and while your skills will now cost more essence to cast, they're going to deal so much more damage that the trade-off is absolutely worth it. Next is Hued Flesh, which gives all your damage a chance to generate a corpse. I put 3 points in here to maximize its potential. A 12% chance might not sound like a lot, but I'm usually generating more corpses than I know what to do with. The most crucial element of Hued Flesh is that this chance percentage is doubled against bosses. This talent alone takes a lot of the pressure away from those 1v1 scenarios I was talking about. But we're not done. I took the unupgraded Blood Mist ability. It does very little damage and even less healing, but that's not why we're taking it. Blood Mist makes you immune to everything for a few short seconds. This is great for dodging unavoidable damage, but mostly comes in handy as a panic button for when you get crowd controlled. Not a mandatory pick, but it has saved my life more than a few times. I maxed out Grim Harvest for extra essence regen. If you're going to be exploding so many corpses, you might as well get some essence every time you do it. It's perfect for topping off between encounters too. 3 points into Fueled by Death gives you a 9% damage buff for 6 seconds after exploding a corpse. Same principle here, it's free damage, so I say take it. Let's not forget that this is a Bone Spear build, and make sure we max out Serration, Compound Fracture, and Evulsion to buff our crit chance and crit damage. If you're still feeling too squishy, feel free to max out Necrotic Carapace for some fortified damage reduction, but if you're like me, I opted to max out Rapid Ossification instead so I can reduce the cooldown of our final ability, Bone Storm. Bone Storm is our ultimate ability, and I decided to spend the extra 2 points to upgrade it fully. With a base cooldown of only 1 minute, you'll be able to use it basically on cooldown for some quick and easy buffs to our crit chance and damage resistance with some extra AoE damage sprinkled in. The last few talent points are going into maxing out Standalone. Even with no minions, this damage resistance is still worth the investment. And then 3 points into Memento Mori, which boosts our sacrifice bonus from our skeletal warriors and mages by an incredible 60%. Speaking of sacrifice bonuses, let's go over the Book of the Dead really quickly. The Book of the Dead is how necromancers enhance their undead companions, but you can sacrifice them and choose a buff for each type instead. For this build, we're sacrificing skeletal skirmisher warriors for 5% higher crit chance, skeletal cold mages for an extra 15% damage to vulnerable enemies, and sacrificing the Iron Golem for a whopping 30% crit damage boost. And remember, with Memento Mori, those first 2 buffs are boosted by 60%. So that's it. That's the build that got me through most of the campaign, all the way through the first capstone dungeon, and World Tier 3 hasn't slowed me down yet. Before we wrap this up, I thought I'd give you some tips with which aspects to hunt down and where to find them, which affixes to keep an eye out for, and then some gear and other odds and ends. As for aspects, there are 3 that really help make this build one of the best out there for Necromancer. The first is Aspect of Torment, and it's first because it's located in Fractured Peaks at the Black Asylum dungeon, which is pretty easy to get to regardless of where you are in game. Aspect of Torment makes your crits with bone skills increase your essence regen by 20% for 4 seconds, and anything that gives us more essence is a no-brainer. Next up is the Splintering Aspect that you've heard me mention a few times already. This one is really a game changer as it lets you apply Vulnerable to big groups of enemies with your Bone Spear, and then gives your Bone Spear shards a 50% damage boost against vulnerable enemies, and lets your shards pierce enemies. Taking this aspect allows you to free up those vulnerable talents from Bone Splinters and Bone Spear that I talked about, and pick the crit focus talents instead. You should get this as soon as possible, and you can get it by completing the Gulran Slums dungeon in Dry Steppes. The last aspect I recommend is Aspect of Grasping Veins, which enhances your corpse tendrils quite a bit to feed into the crit focused build we're working with here. This aspect essentially marks the enemies that are hit by your corpse tendrils, gives you a plus 10% crit chance against them, and then boosts your crit damage against those enemies by another 30%. With all these aspects, you'll be pulling enemies into tight groups, debuffing them, and nuking them with corpse explosions and bone spears, and then using bone splinters as needed to generate essence. You can find Aspect of Grasping Veins in the Corrupted Grotto dungeon in Kyrgyzstan. When looking at gear drops, you'll want to prioritize stats like intelligence and dexterity to enhance your skill damage and crit chance. But also keep an eye out for useful affixes, like anything that directly increases bone skill damage or increases your max essence capacity. Anything with lucky hit perks, like this one that gives me me a chance to gain essence when hitting vulnerable enemies with my bone skills. Anything that boosts core skill damage, damage to crowd-controlled enemies, stunned enemies, slowed enemies, and vulnerable enemies, anything with extra charges of dodge or extra ranks of your key skills like Bone Spear, Corpse Explosion, and Corpse Tendrils, and anything that gives you healing like Blood Orbs or Life on Kill. Weapons and gems are mostly down to your personal preference. I went with a one-handed scythe and shield for just a little bit of extra defense. Make sure to throw the highest quality sapphire you have into your weapon though for a nice crit damage bonus against crowd-controlled enemies. The only endgame gear-specific recommendations I have are to use the ring you get for completing the campaign. Mine gave me a nice perk that lets me refund 35% of the essence cost of any of my core skills that hit 5 or more enemies, which is perfect for Bone Spear. That, and once you're into World Tier 3, try to hunt down some of the sacred unique items. I got these gloves called the Howl from Below, and these make your corpse explosions spawn little skeletons that run towards enemies and boost the explosion damage by 35%. These are a random drop in World Tier 3, so you can't really farm for them specifically, but keep at it and you might get lucky like I did. And that's all I got. If you want to see my full build, stick around to see every talent and point allocation. Just bear in mind that I'm maxed out on talent points here, including the bonus points from renown ranks. For more Diablo 4 tips and breakdowns, make sure to check out our ever-expanding guides collection, and for everything else gaming, keep it right here on IGN.